This is episode 4 of the Rambling On podcast. Recent news has highlighted the anticipation among the Western nations and NATO for a potential conflict with Russia within the next 2 decades, although some have predicted earlier than that. If you've seen this and your initial reaction to those headlines is one of skepticism of these statements, I share that sentiment. I would and did merely dismiss these as typical mainstream media fear-mongering attempts to get views and push whatever agenda that their friends in government intend on spreading. I mean, we've all heard such claims in the past. When it was Saddam Hussein back then with weapons, or China, Iran, North Korea, Russia now. It's almost, we know the script. However, this time I think it is different. I don't think it's merely another story that news outlets are trying to spin. There's a lot more intention behind these headlines, I believe, and one I think we should be paying more attention to, not just a here a day, gone tomorrow story. So, who is it that's been saying these things? Well, Admiral Rob Bauer, chairman of NATO's military committee, has emphasized the need for civilians to be prepared for a possible war with Russia within 2 decades. This sentiment has actually been echoed by German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius in a separate statement, who also suggested that Putin might declare war on NATO within 5 to 8 years. In the United Kingdom even, General Sir Patrick Saunders, the Chief of the General Staff, the highest ranking military official in the British Army, stated that Britain should train a citizen army and be ready for a land battle in the near future. And his comments follow closely after warnings from other NATO leaders, military leaders, about the potential conflict with Vladimir Putin and Russia specifically. These remarks come from very informed officials in Western countries about the possibility of another significant war in the near future. And these remarks are very troubling. And for those who have read these headlines or have maybe heard these statements for the first time and feel alarmed about the prospect, I think those concerns are very natural. After all, these are officials who have access to information and insights into military developments that the general public do not have. And therefore, their words should be heeded and listened to very carefully. I certainly do not want to be involved or even live through any such war that's so close to home. But in fact, no, not even home. Any war is horrible. And if it's unavoidable, it should be done. It should be avoided at all costs. Unfortunately, for someone my age and even people younger, we have already lived through at least one war. Not that we've physically been affected by it, but we've certainly seen it on the news. My earliest recollection is my earliest recollection, that is not the earliest one I lived through, but my earliest recollection was Afghanistan, and there have been more since. However, despite what I think most people would agree, war being a terrible, terrible phenomenon in the human world, I think, and I can't help but think and observe that the narrative of what's being said at the moment is implying, very subconsciously, that we will inevitably be at war with Russia. Regardless of what happens, I think, from what I've observed and I'm listening to, I think we will. Or I think they want to be. I think they want him gone. And I think they intend on getting their way. And by they, I mean West, NATO, all of the above. If you examine these statements through a scope of human behaviour, delivering unfavourable news, particularly that which is expected to be met with resistance, or the news is unexpected. Delivering this news requires a nuanced and, quite, to put it more frankly, a cunning approach, rather than abruptly unveiling distressing information onto someone or onto the population. The more astute individuals, or those with a mastery of manipulation, often choose to allow the gradual anticipation of unfavourable news. Carefully timed snippets. This, I believe, aligns with the inherent tendencies of humans and the human mind to better accept news that would otherwise be intolerable. It seems to me as if the cogs of the propaganda machine are slowly turning, strategically leveraging human psychology to ultimately accept whatever news is coming over the proverbial hills. And so, when the time does arrive to declare war on Russia, which is now hypothetical, might not be in the future, not only will the opinions of the populace shift from fear, hesitation and worry to acceptance, but ideally from the perspective of someone who is trying to get people on their side, not just acceptance, but readiness and willingness to fight. That's how I view this. And I want to clarify just one thing, that this isn't an observation that I've made alone. I haven't sort of deciphered this as a revelation in human psychology. This is a well-known tactic and part of human psychology, and in many studies as well. I'm just simply connecting the dots here. And in fact, this method has been used for centuries as a way of warming people up to the idea of something that they would naturally be opposed to otherwise. I guess war is a very good example of that, because a select few people will know when war's coming, but the general population won't. So if they can get people on their side, if anything, whoever's leader at the time can be seen as a hero. Leaders typically are most beloved when they are war heroes. But from the language that I see, and maybe it's just an intuitive feeling I get about the statements and just seeing what's happening around the world, the feeling I get about these statements is that the opportunity for a peaceful negotiation with Putin, Russia, is entirely inconceivable. And no matter what happens, the only way they see this ending, it's not a cold war, but it's certainly a conflict. And I'm not talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'm just talking about this, very cloak and dagger war between the West and Russia. The only way I think they see this ending is if he is removed from power. Whether he's killed, arrested, I don't know. But he's gone. And his cronies around him are gone as well. I'd certainly hope, that war would be the absolute last resort between two big superpowers. And no matter what, we will try and use pen and paper to settle issues as opposed to guns and bullets. And as baffling as this may sound, actually, in the 21st century, at least, wars are actually very rare. The average probability that a given country starts a war against another given country in any given year is 0.31%. Meaning that one way or another, wars are quite uncommon. But even though this number appears to be low, I don't want to give people a false sense of security, because as we all know and have experienced and witnessed and seen, war does happen. And as we're seeing at the moment, there are currently two big wars taking place in Ukraine and Palestine. But of course, they are not the only wars that are currently going on. There are a lot smaller ones taking place. On top of that, of course, you have countries like America that have huge war budgets and have even coined phrases such as the military-industrial complex due to the vast influence war has on American politics and finances and the stock market. Not to mention the wars that the West have been involved in, even from the start of the 21st century. So by no means am I saying here that wars are uncommon, because anyone listening to this has been alive when a Western country has been involved in a war. So they're uncommon, but they happen, and we've all experienced it. But regardless, it is certainly worrying when governments are effectively saying it's likely that we'll be at war soon. Because, as I said before, it makes one think that war is inevitable, no matter what happens between now and 20 years' time, unless, of course, Putin steps down or something happens, a big change happens in Russia. And I think a distinction needs to be made between preparedness and intent when referring to war and maybe defensive capabilities. I think it's entirely acceptable, and this is referring back to the comments made by British General. I think it's entirely acceptable to say that, and I think it's actually highly advisable to say or to have a well-equipped, well-numbered armed forces, which ironically, of course, we don't have, and indeed most NATO countries don't have, despite these comments. However, it's completely different from saying that, okay, we should always be prepared no matter what. We need to be well-equipped, well-numbered, and know what's going on around the world, versus we anticipate war within 2 decades, so everyone start doing push-ups and get your miles in, because you guys are going to war, which is what I think has sort of been said here. So Grant Shapps, who was now the Defence Secretary. By the way, a year and a half ago, this man was the Secretary of State for Transport. This is something I think is really stupid about politics in this country, and I think we get entirely wrong. So Grant Shapps has no background in the armed forces whatsoever, and he's the Secretary of Defence. I mean, talk about ill-preparedness and lack of appropriate leadership. I mean, if you just imagine you're on a plane and you look at, there's like an open profile of the pilot, and you look at it and you see that this is the pilot's first flight. And before this, he worked in the same company, in the same airline, but he worked in the transportation logistics department. And before that, he was in administration. Suddenly, you're 30,000 feet in the air, and that first-class ticket you bought to Bali has now become the most expensive skydive you've ever heard of. Anyway, Grant Shapps, who has no experience in defence or military capabilities whatsoever, warned that the world could be engulfed by wars involving China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran in the next 5 years. That was a quote. And continued by saying that we are moving from a post-war to pre-war world. So I certainly don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it seems that those in the know are anticipating war fairly soon. And for those listeners who aren't in the UK, whom I think is likely nobody, but maybe you are, or maybe you are and you just haven't heard, as I alluded to before, senior military officials in the UK have laid out the prospect or recommendation of a citizens' army, whereby we, the citizens, are trained and armed to fight in a potential conflict. And this was actually reiterated by a former top NATO commander, British former NATO commander, General Sir Richard Sheriff, who went on Sky News and said that it was time to think of the unthinkable and consider UK conscription. In a modern society, I think the prospect of conscription, especially in the UK, is a shocking one. And a lot of people would not be willing to fight for this country if that decision came about. Of course, conscription is, you don't really get a choice. But anyway. So a survey commissioned by GB News, which asked people aged 18 to 24 if they would be willing to fight for the country in a war. Their results found that only 14% would be willing to fight, whilst 43% had said they would do whatever it takes to avoid fighting. Now, this survey asked 1,648 people, so it's not an entirely accurate representation of the whole population, but it does give you a sense of what people's opinions are towards this idea. I think conscription is quite an interesting idea because, it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting idea because it's probably one of the most stark examples of the dangers of having big government in a society. What's fascinating about it, I think, is that people who would typically be in favour of bigger governments, people on the left, socialists and the like, they believe that government should have more control over people's lives, less responsibility of the individual. So big government, they make the decisions for you, they provide more things. It's almost, I kind of liken it to, as a socialist, you live in a hotel where things are provided to you. Conversely, people on the right are generally in favour of smaller government. At least that's the idea. I think a lot of Conservative voters and MPs actually now prefer big government too. But if you think in the case of maybe classic liberalism, libertarianism, maybe more traditional conservatism, they are on the opposite side. They prefer smaller government. And if you use the analogy of a hotel, you live in a hotel where things are provided to you. The opposite side of that is you provide everything for yourself. You go out, you cook, you get your food, you do the cleaning, it's a very weak analogy, but I think it's quite a good example because the hotel is the state there. And obviously you as an individual, the onus is on you to do everything, to provide everything that you need. So the natural conclusion, so knowing these two different political ideas, the natural conclusion you would draw is that those on the left would be in favour of the idea of conscription because it's a big government. We have voted in you to make the correct decisions. If this is what you think, this is what we'll do. Whereas people on the right would typically be against it. The reality is, I believe, this isn't necessarily true. This is what I anticipate would be the case. Those on the left view this as incredibly negative and definitely would not fight, whilst there are more people on the right who would be a lot more welcoming to the idea. So, in essence, it's a complete 180 degrees turn on political philosophy from both sides. So why that is, I think, why you see this change or, this reverse in political ideas, I believe is somewhat of a new phenomenon. Let's say 50, 60 years ago, another big war breaks out. We're in the Cold War period at this time. World War II is not too long over, but the Cold War's, it's going ahead. And let's say a war breaks out and the government needs more people to join the army. So they introduce conscription. I believe that on both sides of the political spectrum, you would find a lot more willingness by the people to answer the call, both traditional Labour and Conservative. And I say traditional Labour because they do vary from, maybe let's call it the New Labour voters of today. And we saw the difference between traditional Labour and New Labour today in the 2019 election, I think it was, when what they called the Red Wall in the north actually voted Conservative because they felt the New Labour Party were not representing the working man. Anyway, traditional Labour and traditional Labour voters are still very much so proud unionist British people. Labour, or more broadly the socialist voter of today, the New Labour, is a lot less patriotic towards the UK and views the country with a lot more disdain, shall we say. Therefore, the call for conscription would fall on a lot of deaf ears. I think it's also quite common now to see many younger people who might be first, second, maybe third generation immigrants who are also socialists, who view Britain not as their home, but instead they view the UK as a country that is, and this is taken from things that I've seen in the news, social media, in articles. So this isn't like these aren't speculative comments. These are things that in comments I've discussions I've engaged with people actually. A lot of people view the UK as a racist country, as an oppressive country, as a place where they feel they don't belong, and instead consider their hereditary country as being home instead of the UK. So they view the UK as just a place where they live, but it's not home for them because they don't feel welcome. Many people still view the United Kingdom as not just a former colonising country, but they view them as colonisers still. So naturally, with that thought process, fewer people will be willing to fight for the country that they do not view as their own. Now, I mean, that in itself is a different topic and one that could be fiercely debated. So for now, I'm just going to park that one, primarily because I don't have anyone to debate with, because no one actually listens to this, but I will at some point, hopefully. Conversely, what I think would happen then as it would now is that people on the right in the war back then would answer the call of duty, as it were. And I think what causes those opposed to big government, so typically people on the right, to abandon their ideology so willingly and even ostracize those who don't follow suit, in fact, because that's certainly something that you see. So if we consider the right, but more specifically conservatives, and not the party, the ideology, though they may favour a smaller state, they are still advocates for state intervention to a significant enough degree. But they are generally seen as more patriotic compared to the modern socialist counterparts. And even though they are probably not gleeful at the idea of going to war, they view it as a necessary tool to keeping the country safe. And if you mix that recognition with patriotism, you'll find that they are far more likely to answer the call of duty. So that's sort of what I suspect the reasons why the differences you would find. But generally there is a strong reluctance amongst the younger generation who would theoretically be called up, and those are for the reasons I said before. There's a lot more younger socialist people. There's a lot more first, second, third immigration children who view the country not as their own, so they wouldn't want to fight. And there are also people from the UK who maybe not children of immigrants or immigrants themselves, but they also view the UK as a horrible place to live, etc. But aside from maybe the political aspect of it, that's not the only issue that presents itself when discussing conscription. Another more threatening obstacle lingers, not yet in focus specifically. That is the fact that this nation is the most overweight / obese it has ever been. And every year, the record-breaking trend continues. In fact, the United Kingdom has the worst obesity crisis in Europe. So I decided to have a look online to see what sort of statistics I could find. So as per the government statistics, in 2021-2022, 63.8% of adults, men and women, in England were estimated to be overweight or obese. 63.8. That's broken down by 25.9% of those being just obese, and the remaining 38%, roughly 38%, being overweight. Those are worrying statistics. And I suspect those stats are not too dissimilar across the rest of the country in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. However, that does represent all adults, including those who would not be conscripted due to other reasons such as age. On that same report, the obesity and overweight rates amongst the elderly population was also high, so it's definitely being dragged up. So instead, if I be more specific with my age selection, the statistics aren't actually much better. quite frankly. In the age range 16 to 24, 28% of the population in England are at least overweight, 8% being obese. In the age range of 25 to 34, 59% are at least overweight, 24% being obese. In the age range 35 to 44, and 44 would probably be the oldest that the UK would include in conscription. I suspect it would be younger than that, but it's probably the oldest they'd go. 66, so 35 to 44, 66 are at least overweight, 27% being obese. So why as we get older we get more obese? There are several reasons for that, and they make sense as to why it happens. Not excusable, but different reasons are, as you get older, you're less active, your metabolism slows down, you work. A lot of people now work in offices, they sit down a lot. So anyway, so if we consider that the United Kingdom has, as do many, in fact most other countries around the world, has an aging population, which means, in fact, that there's a lot less fighting age people to rely on, and the ones that we do have are overweight or obese. So during the Second World War, the conscription age was between 19 and 41. Now, the average age in the British Armed Forces, so Army, Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, is 31. So if the government introduced a form of limited conscription today, as they did in World War II, but instead of age and profession, they did those who are currently physically able, they are automatically reduced by roughly 40% of the fighting population. And that solely considers those who aren't overweight, because of course you then have to discount others who are physically unable through a disability, or mentally unable through a disability, but whatever else, and any other, miscellaneous reasons why. So conscription is not looking like a very reliable resource for the British Army if they want to respond, or if they really do anticipate a war with Russia in as early as 8 years, as some people have said. They really need to, reconsider their strategy. They can't rely on a fighting fit young population as they did 50, 60 years ago. And the other issue, of course, separate from the conscription aspect, is the fact that the British Army is so terribly small, underfunded, that we wouldn't be able to, realistically, we would not be able to sustain a war. And this is definitely not a new revelation that's come to the fore. This has been known for a long, long time. You can see over the years the terrible state in which the British Army is in. Now, when I say terrible state, of course I don't mean that the individual British soldier, whether he be Navy, Army, Royal Air Force or Special Forces, that's not to say that those guys and girls are not good. It's the policy towards our armed forces, how we've treated, how we've managed our armed forces over the years. And it's quite shocking, actually. So I decided again to get some references about the British Army over the years. So in 1950, this is the size of the army. So in 1950, the British Army had 364,000 regular troops, 83,000 reserve troops, for a total of 447,000 troops in total. In 1970, that was reduced to 176,000 regular troops, 80,000 reserve troops, and 256,000 troops in total. So that's a big drop in total troops right there. In 1990, we go down to 153,000 regular troops, 73,000 reserve troops, 226,000 troops in total. So a reduction in 30,000. not as drastic between 1950 and 1970. And although the regular troops have dropped a lot, the reserve troops numbers are still fairly high. But between 1950 and 1990, we have practically halved in size in total. So we go to 2010, 113,000 regular troops, 29,000 reserve troops, 142,000 troops in total. And just so I'm clear here, these statistics so far have been army exclusive, so they do not include the other two branches. Okay? So, in 2023, the size of our total armed forces combined, Army, Air Force, RAF, is 142,560. So in 13 years, the size of our military personnel, everyone, has shrunk to the same size as what our army was, just our army, in 2010. That's huge. The number of soldiers that we have, troops in the army, I think it's roughly like 73,000. Very, very, very small. Now, an argument could be made that in the UK, we've never been known for having or fielding a massive army. And that's true. The United Kingdom have always been quite known for a smaller, specialised army, and our real speciality comes from our special forces, who are, and some people may disagree, but disagree all they want, our special forces are the best in the world, namely the SAS and the SBS. So the argument that we've never had a big army has some validity to it. However, what we have always had in large numbers and have always been very capable of was the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy has kept the United Kingdom safe for many, many wars over many years, because we're an island, so a navy is very important. If we weren't an island, then we were a land country. We were connected to continental Europe. You would expect that we would need more soldiers. We're an island, albeit not too far off the coast, which is probably good because we can block any incoming ships. The Navy saved us in the Second World War, saved us in the First World War, it saved us in the Napoleonic War, probably most notably the Napoleonic War, and Britain has always been known for having a good navy. So we can rely on that, right? Wrong. Just for reference, in 2013, it was quite difficult to find numbers for the navy size, for one reason or another, I'm not too sure. But our navy has also shrunk in size significantly. So in 2013, we had a total number of 78 vessels. In 2017, that number went down to 72. And in 2023, for the first time, I believe ever, our navy dropped below 70 and is at 68 vessels. For comparison, it's quite difficult to make a comparison to the Second World War because the number of ships sort of varied over time. But for a comparison, by the end of the war in 1945, the Royal Navy had just over 900 ships, and these are major warships that included aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This does not include smaller ships like minesweepers, patrol boats, and other support ships like the RFA. Now, in that statistic that I just gave of it being 68, that does include smaller ships and also includes the RFA, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. So what do we have today in the UK? What is our navy comprised of? Well, we have 2 aircraft carriers, that are fairly new, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Queen Elizabeth. We have 6 Type 45 destroyers. These are seen as the backbone of the Navy, and we have 6 of them. We have 11 Type 23 frigates, 10 submarines, and 35 patrol and mine vessels. So when you actually look at the 68 figure, really, you need to subtract 35 from that, because those are not fighting ships, or they're not, real ships that you would want to operate by themselves. So our Navy as well has been massively reduced. And so if you were to use the argument that, okay, the British Army has never been big, that's a fair enough argument to make. But the Royal Navy has always been big. So you can't have it that, well, it's never the Army's never been big, so we should keep it small, but we're also going to keep the Navy small. No, it doesn't work both ways, unfortunately. If you're not going to have a lack of one, or if you're going to have a lack of one, you need to have the other. So this then also all boils down to, well, first of all, why has this happened? Where has this come from? Well, militaries are expensive, and I'm not saying for a moment that we need to have over 900 ships, because that was wartime, and during wartime very exceptional things happen. But you would want that there would be a substantial number of ships and fighting personnel to protect the country, and unfortunately we just don't. The numbers for the Royal Navy, I'm not too sure. That was also quite difficult to find, but rest assured that's also reduced, and you will know this because of the following statistics I'll give you about our budget spending. So obviously, as you can deduce from that, we have significantly reduced the amount of money we've spent on our armed forces, and this isn't total spend. That's obviously gone up due to inflation, etc. But I'm talking about UK defence budget as a percentage of GDP. So in 1960, the United Kingdom spent roughly 7.09% of the total budget on defence. 1970, it was 5.2. 1980, it was 5.02. 1990, it was 3.98%. In 2000, it was 2.37%, and in 2010 it was 2.57%. The lowest it reached was in 2017, 2018, and it was 1.92%, which, by the way, is below the NATO commitment. And it was like that for 2 years. In 2021, it increased to 2.22% of GDP. As per the latest figures, the United Kingdom spent £55.5 billion on our defence. So the spring budget, the 2023 spring budget, allocated an additional £5 billion to defence spending over the next 2 years. So 2023 to 2024, and then 2024, 2025. And a further £2 billion per year in subsequent years up until 27-28. This increases defence spending by a total of £11 billion over the 5-year period. As a result, the annual defence budget will be £5.8 billion higher in cash terms by the end of the current spending review period. However, when you adjust this for inflation, the increase in defence spending over this period is only expected to be 1.1 billion as opposed to 5.8. So really not that much. We're sending more over to Ukraine than what we're looking to increase in our own spending. And most of this additional funding has been allocated to capital budgets, so money that is spent on major projects and investment. Whereas the Ministry of Defence day-to-day budget is actually set to decline in real terms over this period. So, if we then refer back to the comments that are being made by our military officials, if they are planning to go to war, or they are planning for a war with Russia, this is nowhere near enough. And in fact, as per the UK House of Commons Instagram page, the British Army has a recruitment issue, shock, and they are losing personnel faster than they can recruit. They even say that the United Kingdom, or they do not believe that the United Kingdom are at war fighting readiness. And recently MPs were told that Britain would exhaust its capabilities after 2 months of a peer-to-peer war. And peer-to-peer war means a war not where you're fighting terrorists in a foreign country, you're fighting someone with, equal stature, such as, for example, a war with Russia. And in 2 months, they were told that we would exhaust our capabilities. And in fact, quite recently, I remember reading when Ben Wallace was the Defence Secretary that a US general had privately told Ben Wallace that the British Army is no longer regarded as a top-level fighting force. So you can see here where the fantastic policies that we've had has led us into quite a predicament. And in fact, just in 2021, we were actually aiming to cut our troop numbers down to 72,500 by 2025. So Ben Wallace, who was then the Defence Secretary, the absolute military genius he is, announced a major overhaul of the armed forces, where he said it marked a shift from mass mobilisation of troops to information age speed, insisting they must be able to seek out and understand new threats to the country's security. I think that's very ironic because I don't know what mass mobilisation he's talking about, and the only threat to the country's security is reducing the size of the armed forces. Not the only threat, but it's certainly a big threat. And, for one reason or another, we've now replaced Ben Wallace, who in fairness was in the army, with Grant Shapps, who was Education Secretary, or he was Transport Secretary. That's what he was. So as we've seen, and you can start to see where people have started to piece these ideas together now about conscription. They've seen what's been happening in Russia, in Ukraine, possibly eyeing up what China could be doing in Israel, Palestine, and they've gone, maybe all those cuts that we made weren't the best idea. And we're struggling to recruit people. What do we do? Oh, well, I know what we can do. We can maybe think, what about a citizens' army? And that should start to make sense to people why they may be thinking about that, because they've realised that they're old. All their policies up until now have been completely useless and put us in a lot of danger. So the UK has a recruitment issue, clearly, as has been stated. And I don't personally think that to solve or to prepare for war, I don't think it's a good idea to train a citizens' army. But I'll get to that later. First of all, how do we solve the recruitment issue? We need to ensure, I believe, look, I'm not an expert on this, but if we are to solve this recruitment issue, the first thing we need to do is we need to ensure that our personnel in the armed forces are being properly compensated for their services, both now as they're currently serving and once they have left service and they're retired, they can move on to something else. They need to be properly compensated. Now, I have no experience with the pay structure in the armed forces, but I have spoken to people before, bumped into people who have been in the army, and they've actually said to me, so the story is I bumped into this gentleman once. We didn't know each other, and he thought I was in the army because a bunch of the army boys were over skiing for, I think they call it something like extreme weather training or something, and they were just on holiday, but it was paid for by the army. And he was talking to me about the pay, and he basically mentioned that, my generation are getting, the salaries are a lot worse, or the pensions are a lot worse for my generation than his. And I told him that I'm not actually in the army, but I quizzed him on this. And he essentially said that they've just changing the salary structure or the pension structure for the younger generation, and it's a lot less attractive and it's a lot worse than what it used to be. So people aren't really getting rewarded that well for being in the army, for putting their lives on the line, whilst civil servants and other, let's call them jobs, public jobs, are getting very, very good salaries and very good pensions. So that's what the first thing we need to do, is ensure that they are being properly rewarded, and they are becoming they are competing with industry standards. Because I do know, and as that video by the UK House of Commons on Instagram said, that they're actually not being as competitive as other industries, and that's why they're struggling. It's one of the reasons why they're struggling. There seems to be as well a lack of assistance for our ex-servicemen and women, and that is also something that needs to be changed, so that when they do come back into civilian life, they are receiving the support and the help that they need to make that switch, to reintegrate back into civilian life, whether they do go into another job or whether they just retire. I mean, how many times have we seen on the streets, have we heard on the news, ex-servicemen and women who are on the street because, they finished the army and then there was no real support for them. They couldn't get a job. Maybe they had PTSD and they're homeless now. And this isn't good. This really isn't good. People who are willingly going in to serve and defend this country. I mean, if they're doing this to people who are willing to fight, how do you think they're going to treat people who've been conscripted? Are they then going to decide all of a sudden, oh, actually, yeah, maybe we should start giving you people support? Or is it going to be even worse? Either way, it's not a very good reflection on how we treat them. So there needs to be a lot more support of what we're doing during and what we're doing after, whether it's rehabilitation, whether it's assisting with the reintegration into society, because that's, again, no experience in this, but from conversations I've had and things that you hear, very difficult to reintegrate back into society. The other way I think we solve this recruitment issue is by making visas a lot easier for Commonwealth soldiers, or Commonwealth countries, people from Commonwealth countries. We have a huge pool of talent of people who want to come to the United Kingdom for a number of different things, whether it is the army or whether it's not. But if it is, and even if it isn't, we need to ensure that we're making these visas a lot easier for them, making it a lot easier for them to come into. I do know that, for example, there are windows of applications for people from the Commonwealth to apply to the army. This is from conversations I've had from people who are from the Commonwealth and who have joined the army. They only have a certain window to do so. We're lucky enough to have good, hard-working people from these places that want to come here. And as I said, there's a good portion of those who actually join the army, as well as, for example, the Gurkhas. Gurkhas are one of the most formidable soldiers on earth, and they are able to join the British Army, and it's seen as a great honour if they do. We should be rewarding these people with the ability to stay, with all the support that a typical citizen would get. And as far as I'm aware, we're not, and that's shameful, truly shameful. So not only should we be improving the recruitment and the standards and the conditions for people in the UK, we should also be encouraging those who want to fight for the United Kingdom from Commonwealth, which we created. We should also be supporting them. It seems our priorities around immigration is aimed at the wrong people, I think. As I said, we should prioritise those who are willing to serve the country and keep it safe. But that just doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. So they certainly need to re-strategize their recruitment goals. If you, as well, I read this article that it was titled, the UK to relax security checks for recruits with a goal to improve inclusion and diversity drive. And that was from the Telegraph. Now, whatever your opinions on mandated diversity quotas in any industry are, the armed forces, there is no place for that in the armed forces. Whoever wants to serve and passes all the tests, you're in. Otherwise, you're not. Simple. There should be no not accepting someone into the army simply because they're white. That's, incredibly ridiculous. I mean, if you want to drive diversity and inclusion, whatever that really means, we want to have more inclusion in the army. The best way to do it is make it more attractive. That is the best and only way you can and should do it. If you're looking to lower standards of security checks to try and get more people into the army from places that are not even in the Commonwealth, when you have people from the Commonwealth who want to join, that's a massive slap in their face, and it's very stupid and possibly quite dangerous. I don't really know the details of what this plan entails regarding reducing security checks. Sounds very, very silly. It would be like saying, we want to increase tourism into the country, so we're going to reduce our checks at security. Once you come into the airport, we'll reduce those. Hopefully more people will come in then. So, really bad idea, and this is what I mean. We should be... I think whoever's in charge of these decisions really needs to re-strategize. One thing as well I do like the idea of is what they have in France. They have what's called the Foreign Legion, whereby people from anywhere around the world, whether you're French or not, if you're part of French overseas territories, you can be from anywhere in the world. I believe you can be an ex-criminal as well, actually. You join the French Foreign Legion and you serve with them for a number of years. I can't remember the details of it. And after so many years of serving, you actually get French citizenship. And the idea is, I guess in a way it's sort of similar to what the goals were for the what they were saying about the army with diversity and inclusion, except there's no need to reduce the number of soldiers, reduce the checks, the security checks, because in the French Foreign Legion you still have security checks. So there's no need to do that. But the idea of a Foreign Legion, a British Foreign Legion, for example, is an interesting one. And I think it could work if done properly. And I do like that idea. And that could be one, potentially, to solve our problems. But interestingly, actually, in the French Foreign Legion, how they operate, and I believe this is correct, you actually don't swear loyalty to the French army. You swear loyalty to the Foreign Legion itself, which is a nice, interesting little fact. If you want to find out more about the Foreign Legion, very interesting. As I said, anyone can join, and there was an interesting story actually recently, or an article where people, they were Russians and they were Ukrainians, and they used to serve in the Foreign Legion, but now together. But obviously now they're fighting in a different war against each other. There's that possibility. I don't know if they were mercenaries at one point. They may have been, but it's an interesting concept, and I think it works quite well. They're not an elite fighting force, but the training is very difficult, and you have to speak French, so you learn that other language. And after so many years of service, I think it's like 10 years of service, could be more, could be less, you become a French citizen. So an interesting idea that could be explored. Highly doubt it will be, but an idea that could be explored. So, those are ways that we can improve or fix our recruiting issues. I think the main thing is incentives. You need to incentivize more people to come to join. And if we can do that, then that solves the issue. But, of course, it's not just about numbers. It's also about the strength. And, again, I just want to make one thing clear. I'm in no capacity am I qualified to discuss the intricacies of our military or defence strategy. But I do know a thing or two about history. And I do know that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. And if you if you are not prepared for war, for any eventuality, you'll eventually lose. So again, as being a island nation, our navy is probably one of the most important things that we could have. So, we really need to make sure, I believe, that we are strengthening the navy. The pride of the armed forces is the navy. But aside from sentimental things like the pride of the navy, we need to be practical here, and the navy is very important, and that's something that we definitely need to improve on. The air force as well, something that I haven't really spoken about much because it was quite difficult to find, but the Royal Air Force is significantly underfunded as well. So it's really investment in our industry as well as just the actual, the armed forces. We need to have that industrial base secure, so it's always there and we can always rely on it. So once you have that industrial base, that's when you can start to get. It's easier to build ships, it's easier to build planes, it's easier to build tanks, weapons, etc. So you build that industrial base, and from there you then move on to the shipbuilding, etc. It's important as well that, and we are quite good at this. We are staying on top of all the technological developments. I believe recently the United Kingdom, I think it was like a laser weapon to shoot down drones. I mean, drones are going to be a massive thing, as we've seen, in fact. With in the Middle East, drones have been deployed very effectively, and they're very effective weapons, and they could be a game changer. And I'm not talking about these UAVs that fly up really high. It's like these little remote control drones. They've been deployed in Russia as well. An infantryman's nightmare, I think. So keep on top of the technologies. A few years ago, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, he wanted to disarm our nuclear weapons. And I mean, that guy had some wacky ideas. But that probably had to be one of the stupidest ideas I think I heard him say. I mean, if no one could have nuclear weapons, that would be lovely, because that's probably the biggest threat to mankind is nuclear war. A nuclear apocalypse destroys everything. If it doesn't kill it immediately, it kills it in like 10 years, 5 years even. So ideally it'd be nice, but practically not realistic. Much like, communist views. And he wanted to get rid of Operation Trident, and he wanted us to disarm all our nuclear weapons. So the other thing about, keeping our military strength is keeping on top of weapons, ensuring we have enough to support ourselves, not doing things like getting rid of our nuclear weapons. But it's interesting to it makes you think because the United Kingdom technically is still one of the biggest spenders on defence in the world. And it does make you wonder, how did we get to this position? How did we end up where we're possibly having to rely on conscripted soldiers again? How is it that other countries are looking at us and thinking they're not even a proper fighting force anymore? How is it that we're actually evaluating ourselves and going, we couldn't fight for longer than 2 months, by the way, just letting you know. How has this happened? And there are several contributing factors that have, declined our defensive capabilities over the decades. The primary overarching factor is that we started to view war on our shores as a very distant threat, and therefore the requirement for a substantial armed forces became largely null and void. Even though after the Second World War, great attempts were made to ensure that we never went back to what we'd experienced, we did have the decades of a Cold War. Now, I never personally lived through the Cold War, so I can't speak from experience, but the primary arena of war shifted away from Western Europe, and the main belligerents of this new Cold War were the USA and USSR, not Britain, and this war was more global in its reach, whereas the Second World War was sort of focused, one in Europe and then two in sort of the Pacific and Asia. And for this country, United Kingdom, the Second World War was particularly devastating for us, as it was for many other nations in Europe, but for us it was very devastating, and we sort of threw everything we had at it. And we struggled financially, but also in so many other ways, all the way down to the individual level of a person. So there was an element, I think, of, we're done. No more of this. We are out for the count. And that, I think that was especially true since the theatre of war was far removed. So we were, over the whole large military aspect. And so it was time to reduce the size of our armed forces. Indeed, the conditions in wartime are incredibly exceptional. So a lot of the policies that were implemented to ensure success and survival don't need to be maintained post-war. So the size of the armed forces is a perfect example of that. It's completely unnecessary to have 800 warships and over 1 million soldiers, especially when the country is so poor at this point, so broke. So from the peak of our military strength, that shift to a reduction in the size of our, army, our defensive capabilities was entirely necessary. And running sort of concurrently with that declining threat of war so close to home was also the shift towards focus in other matters that people viewed as more important post-war. Probably one of the most famous examples of a legacy from the war that we did keep was the NHS, which during and just after the war was a completely necessary function. Also, many of our cities were bombed during the Blitz, so the rebuilding of houses was, also massively key. Children missed out on education. People weren't able to work. There were a lot of things. There were many things that people viewed as more pressing to get the country back on its feet, and indeed that there were, in fact. So I think what had happened was during these decades after the war, the state assumed responsibility of all these things and was committing all their resources to that and taking them away from areas not seen as necessary anymore. And if you'll remember during a previous episode, the first episode, I talked about how after the war, Britain had basically given up Palestine because that was something else that's seen as very unnecessary and they didn't need to do it. So, they gave it up, as did they do, for example, the size of the military. Now, unfortunately, as the country started to become more wealthy again, generally this is probably seen as like post-Margaret Thatcher, the legacy of not spending much money on our military, or in fact reducing the money spent on our military, continued. And so this hands-off approach to the military, don't commit any resources, this had really solidified in politics and probably started to become a bit of a career killer if a politician did decide, or a party did decide, to maybe reprioritize our military strategy. And, a very easy argument could be made, especially now, or well, not so much now, but 5-10 years ago or even before, why are we spending money on our military when we have mouths to feed, or homeless people on the streets, or houses to build? And it's very difficult to convince someone that we should always be prepared for a threat just in case. And it's especially difficult when there is no visible or immediate threat. So justifying an increased budget on our defence it's an uphill task. Now, of course, the consequence of the lack of foresight or leadership from our politicians is now that everyone is panicking again. So much so that the idea of a citizens' army is being thrown about. And people who were arguing for a smaller budget for our armed forces all those years ago, or not even all those years ago, could be fairly recently, are likely the same people who would outrightly refuse to join a citizens' army. Now, I talked about this before, but when you have a lack of foresight in decisions, consequences in the future will sneak up, and by that time people can point fingers at anyone else but them. How did we get in this situation? Whose fault is it? Interestingly, the state actually became a lot larger post World War II, as people relied probably too heavily on the government to provide what they believed took precedence in our day-to-day life. So benefits, or the welfare state, the provision of housing, the provision of healthcare, pensions, schools, many publicly owned industries, the number of government employees increased. Everything got bigger. Everything but the armed forces got bigger. And the point I'm trying to make here is that whilst people viewed other things as more important than our defensive capabilities, it also meant that people became very comfortable in life, enjoying the provisions of government money, not thinking about genuine external threats. And I don't want to say, we became comfortable and we became weak, because that seems a bit extreme, but we became not accustomed to hardship as a nation. Because after all, life isn't supposed to be super easy and a walk in the park. It's supposed to have challenges, but I think the difference is people expect life to be easy because the government can make life easy for us. But that's not to say that no one in the country faced hardships, because everyone's situation is different, and there are people who go through many difficult things on an individual level, and that's undeniable. But as a nation, our biggest problem became the government's, not building enough houses, or the government's not providing enough free school dinners, or the government not paying government employees enough money, or the government not taxing corporations enough. So as I say, we got comfortable, and we got comfortable with a luxury lifestyle. But as a result, we also look, with that accompanying of a lifestyle, we also look to find minor issues or create issues that don't exist, so that we can justify asking for more or wanting more. You could sort of draw parallels to parents who grew up with no money, not complaining about that which they don't have, because that was just their life. That was the situation they're in, and they accepted it and they cracked on with it, and that was it. But then they have children who do grow up around money, and they don't appreciate the things they already have, and they enjoy the luxury lifestyle, and they constantly want more because that's what they're used to. They're used to having it all. They're used to being surrounded by this easy luxury life. I mean, how many times have we seen children like that, where their parents, they've worked hard their whole life, and then the children's like, I want more, give me more. And small things are problems to them. Really small things present themselves as massive issues to these kids. And this is similar to what's happening, or what's happened in this country as well. So our biggest issue became not the threat of invasion, or the Germans, or the rise of Nazism or communism. Our biggest issue became wanting more from the government, or just wanting more for ourselves. And if we didn't get that, it was seen as a massive problem. Even if we look at the language that's used by politicians, or by the media, or even by your average person, and that is probably due to the media or the government, they'll say things like, we are at war with, it'll be like the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. We're at war with the Conservative Party. This is a cultural war. Or the biggest threat to our nation is Boris Johnson. Or we love to compare the people that we disagree with to Nazis. How many times do we see comments like, the Conservatives are Nazis? People use this language a lot. And when you do hear comments like those, to me, that shows that people don't actually know what danger really is. People don't know what genuine threats are to our livelihoods. It's more about what people want for themselves and how they feel. And I think it's actually a massive slap in the face to those people who do wake up every day with the threat of a bomb being dropped on their heads. Those people know what fear is. Those people know what problems are. One day their house is there, next day their house is sprawled out, rubble in front of them. So, our problems became more material. What can the government give us to make our lives even better? And I refer back to what I was saying before, when particularly, but not exclusively, immigrants or children of immigrant parents, or grandparents maybe, will make claims that the UK is a really terrible country to live in. It's oppressive and it's racist, and their lives, because of this oppression and this racism, are clearly so difficult, and these are really terrible living conditions in the United Kingdom. And I actually saw a video on Instagram. There was a black lady. I don't know what generation of immigrant she was, but she sounded like she was born in the UK, at least, because she had a very distinct southern accent. And I think she was on maybe GB News, or on a news station, and she claimed that, and actually I quote verbatim, the entire country is racist, and the countryside is not exempt from that. And what people fail to realise is that in these spaces that are particularly dominated by white people, it can end up being quite exclusive. The reason why is that these individuals share the same culture and values, which includes food, language, music, etiquette, manners, hobbies, etc. So when someone new comes along that's different, and they can end up standing out like a sore thumb, they can end up not potentially fitting in, and they also have to contend with the racial prejudice. And that's just an example that I found today to sort of reinforce my point. Maybe not the best, well, actually it is quite a good example, but this was just one that cropped up today, and that sort of backs up what I'm saying. And in fact, for another example, and again, this is quite funny because I actually wanted to draw on another example of something that would reinforce what I'm saying. And all I had to do was go on X and search The Guardian. And the first thing that came up was an article posted today on the 14th of Feb. And it was titled, "Why Have Right-Wingers Made Even Park Run a Battleground for Trans People?" And it continues, "Where non-competitive mass participation jogging is annexed by the cultural warriors. It's clear there are other agendas at play." I mean, that's brilliant. I really wish someone could have seen that because it perfectly reinforces what I'm saying about that language used. So thank you, Jonathan Liu. I think that's his surname. So if anyone wants to go read that riveting article, please do so. But without any context, if the title of an article had those three words, battleground, warriors, and annexed, I'd expect that to be a military report about an ongoing war or an ongoing conflict, not an article about people's feelings getting hurt when jogging in the park. And, that's my point. We use words like these to inflate our problems or create problems that don't exist so we can demand of more or so we can get our own way. People will try and validate their problems with extreme words to invoke a sense of disaster and doom, and they can associate it with real problems. So people will be, yeah, this is a cultural war. This is a battleground of cultural warriors, whatever that really means. Anyway, that's a bit of... I digress slightly, but I wanted to give examples of what I mean when I say that people have become very accustomed to a life of luxury and do not understand what a genuine threat to our lives is, or to our country, or the country you live in. They don't understand what that actually is compared to people who do live in genuine fear. And you compare those two examples, people getting their feelings hurt in running in a park versus people hearing the sound of a bomb being dropped in the street 3 rows down. So, the argument is, why are we spending money on stupid weapons and boats and defence when there's no need to defend ourselves from anything? There are no threats there. So why are we doing this when we should be spending money on feeding people's children and making the countryside less racist and making trans people feel more included when jogging through the park? Our priorities have shifted towards the latter points of what I just said. Granted, some of these priorities are a lot more contemporary than others, but it's nonetheless people looking to the government to give the people what they demand. And I refer back to my previous point about if you don't know your history, you are doomed to repeat it. And I want to use a period in history that's a perfect example of this, of when the Romans left Britain in 410 AD to defend Rome against its enemies as the Roman Empire started to collapse. But in particular, what happened during this time was the local British population, who became known as the Romano-British. So they were very integrated into Roman society. They enjoyed the luxuries that the Romans had bought, right? So they lived in Roman villas. They socialized in the Roman bathhouses. They drank Roman wine. They ate Roman food. They were protected by Roman soldiers. So everything was handy because you had these, Mediterranean lifestyle in cold Britain. And the life's great, we're safe. no one's better than the Roman Empire. They've got all these luxuries. We're wearing all these nice robes. Look at these nice houses we've got. Fantastic. Once the Romans had left Britain and it was just the local Romano-British population were there to fend up for themselves, they were not able to defend themselves to a significant enough degree. There were a few local sort of heroes here and there, but they were not able to defend themselves enough against the threats from the Picts and the Scots up north. So what do? They decide to hire mercenaries from Anglia, Jutland and Saxony to defend them. So these big battle-hardened men come over from, Norway, Germany, Sweden direction to defend, this defenseless race of people who are so accustomed to an easy life that they largely forgot how to fight. So the Anglo-Saxons, they come over in their boats and they successfully defeat the invaders from up north and wherever else in the country. But they recognised that the land in Britain was fertile. But more importantly, the local population were not able to defend themselves because they were living this life of luxury. And they saw this, and once they'd defended them, they said, "Thank you very much for paying us, and we'll take it from here." And for better or for worse, the Anglo-Saxon population eventually replaced the Romano-British. They say, right, we've got rid of your only threat to you and to us, and we are here to stay, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, of course, this isn't a like-for-like comparison of the topic that I'm referring to, but it reinforces my point about the consequences of getting too comfortable and not being, at the very least, prepared for any eventuality. And I'm not saying we're at the point where we are not capable of defending ourselves, but if we were in a peer-to-peer war, we only have 2 months to defend ourselves. So it's not great, is it, really? But I've gone on for quite some time, and I haven't actually spoken about what I intended to speak about, which was conscription in the UK, or at least the idea of conscription in the UK. And despite what I've actually said so far, I'm not actually against the idea of conscription. In fact, I've always believed that a form of national service or conscription would be very beneficial to this country. So what I mean when I say national service isn't just people joining the armed forces and being trained on how to, shoot a gun or run through military drills for a few years. There's a much larger opportunity to teach a great number of young people a variety of different, very important skills that could benefit both them individually and society as a whole. So in this system, let's say, a citizen turns 19 or 18, 19 in this ideal system that, I'm conceiving. And before they go off to do whatever it is they want to do, or maybe, concurrently whilst they're doing it, whether it's university, getting a job, travelling, I don't know what. So before or maybe during they do that, they need to do a certain amount of weeks or months of service. In this service, they could indeed go through military training. However, they could also serve in the more vocational aspect. They could do any sort of civil service. So any type of engineering, maybe mechanics, plumbing, cooking, maybe a medical aspect, assisting nurses and doctors. They could be in care homes, helping with research, helping with the emergency services, maybe more, local council work, landscaping. Maybe they could do farming, clerical work in court. They could even do stuff overseas in an overseas territory. There are a lot of options that could be done. And I think it would be extremely beneficial. As mentioned before, we have a dangerously overweight and unfit society. The worst in Europe, in fact. So if in some way you're able to get those, who are very unhealthy into an active role, ideally you'd be improving those statistics and make the United Kingdom a much fitter country as a whole. Because as we know, one of the reasons why people become overweight as they get older, or maybe they struggle to remain fit, is because they're a lot less active. They in their jobs now, a lot more people sit at their desks for 7, 8 hours, 9 hours a day. They're driving their cars to and from work. When they come home, they sit on the settee. They have dinner, sat down. There's a lot of the sedentary lifestyle is increasing across the globe, especially in the West. So the benefit of that, of course, is that you probably also, by getting more people at the younger ages, keeping them active, keeping them more healthy, is ideally you would see, some of that stress get taken off of the NHS. Less people in hospital for issues that could be preventable if they were just more active. Hopefully, anyway, that would be sort of the plan. Additionally, what you'd see is that we'd have a much more technically skilled labour force. Making the average British worker a more attractive employee. Whether you're looking to work abroad, where you'll be facing competition from other people, or competing for jobs domestically with foreign employees coming to the UK. By having these extra skills that you've picked up here and there, who knows what kind of possibilities that could open up for you. You'd hopefully as well see more productivity in the workforce. Whether this would be the outcome or not, I don't know. But, having people who are multifaceted hopefully improves their productivity. So I don't know if this is true, but it's certainly a possibility. And interestingly, another argument or cause for concern, as some people may view it, is that the world is becoming a lot more specialised in their roles. And what I mean by that is, and this is certainly true for myself compared to the previous generations, I am not very, for example, I'm not very hands-on. I can't build much. I'm not a very good builder. I'm not a carpenter. I don't really know how to farm. I don't know how to grow crops. There's a lot of things I do not know that previous generations are exceptionally good at. They're very well-rounded people. And one of the issues that some people talk about in today's society is that we are becoming too specialised, where we are dependent on other people to do many different things. And if there is, a break in the supply line, obviously it's not really a supply line, but if there's some gap in, this talent pool, there's many people who would have to go without because they don't know how to do a number of different things. Whereas, if you have a form of national service where people they're learning a secondary skill along with their job, you're going to have a much more well-rounded population of workers. And I think that's very important. I think that's very, very, and also very beneficial for the country. But one of the most important and certainly most obvious benefits from a form of national service, I believe, is that we would see a massive reduction in the number of homeless or unemployed people, especially as the younger generation start to phase out the older generation who maybe wouldn't qualify for the national service. You'd see a lot less younger homelessness on the streets or unemployed people. So if you have, as we do, many young people who maybe have bad conditions at home and, they struggle in school because of that or for whatever other reason, and they end up falling behind significantly, and many become homeless, and many more could follow suit. And it becomes, I imagine, very difficult indeed for them to pick themselves back up and start anew, even if they wanted to. If in this national service system, everyone were required to do something where they were learning a new skill, but not only were they learning a new skill, they were given, a certificate or a type of qualification at the end of it. So they do the so many months or whatever of engineering or a mechanical whatever. By the end of it, you're essentially giving them a new skill, and you're giving those people who would otherwise just struggle in life, you're giving them a second chance. How many, if you think about, you see a homeless person on the street and you think there is surely something you could do that would allow you to not be homeless anymore. The issue is not that it's necessarily it's their fault. It's just the way the system works is once you're homeless, it's very difficult to then break through that barrier again, especially if you don't have a support system around you. And I think this is essentially what it does. It gives people, especially those who genuinely want to transform their lives, it gives them another chance. But aside from that, and even if we single out the benefits of military service, as I said before, it keeps people fitter. And that's already a winner. It makes the UK all that more secure as a country. Even if our standing army isn't huge, again, which it never has been, but we will have a huge pool of young men and women who are competent, familiar enough with the requirements of combat in some capacity, whether it's the logistics or whether it's the actual fighting force, and of course are fighting fit. And who wouldn't want that extra reassurance? What's more, there could be a great element of adventure involved, especially, for example, if they had overseas exercises, maybe in Gibraltar or the Falklands or Malta or wherever. And, for some, these opportunities would never arise. Going abroad, for many, is a luxury that they can't afford. And even if it isn't abroad, doing things that they'd never be able to do, seeing different parts of the country that they probably would never see. And with that, I believe it would give also the younger generations a better sense of camaraderie. And that's something I think this country is missing. The country is becoming quite polarised, unnecessarily, and that does present problems in some ways. So strengthening that bond between people in this country can only be a good thing. And I'm sure most people, whether you even agree or disagree with the idea of conscription, you will agree that this country is very polarised, and you're seeing a lot of just division over things that don't necessarily need to be a contentious topic. And, this isn't some revolutionary idea. There are many countries around the world that have some form of conscription. Switzerland, for example, one of the most desirable places to live in the world, has conscription for everyone between the ages of, I think it's 19 and 41, but the upper age limit might be lower than that, I'm not too sure. But how it works in Switzerland is conscripts can choose between, so once you hit the age of 19, conscripts choose between civil service, military service, or they can pay like a special tax to avoid doing any form of service. But I believe the tax is very high, and that tax goes towards funding the military. The initial training is then done in one block. I think it's like roughly 21 weeks. And that's where they are trained in their assigned regiment, and they go through all the drills, how to shoot, etc., maybe tanks or exercises. After that, they then have to engage in yearly trainings so that they remain familiar with the procedure. I don't know how long the yearly trainings are after that. Maybe let's say a week. Could be more, could be less. If they don't join the military, as I said, they can do the civil service, which could involve healthcare, social services, or environmental protection. And that's basically what I had suggested before. The civil service lasts a bit longer than the military service. And also, if someone emigrates to Switzerland and gets the passport and they become a Swiss citizen and they're within the age range, they also have to serve. So people, if you're a British citizen and you move to Switzerland, you get the Swiss passport. If you're lucky enough to get the Swiss passport, because it's very hard, and you're 21 years old, best believe you'll be doing that service in Switzerland as well. And the irony of it is, Switzerland is one of the most neutral countries in the world, and in fact, they don't even have a proper standing army. They have what's called a militia. Yet, if they were forced to react to a military emergency, whereby they've been attacked or something, they could mobilise more battle-ready troops in a week than the United Kingdom could. Now, I could be wrong with the specific numbers, but I think it's something along the lines of within a week, Switzerland can mobilise 100,000 troops. and within a month it's something like 1 million, which is just insane. That's crazy. Very typical Swiss efficiency. But also, it's a very interesting system, because we have a standing military, we have a standing army, and we're supposedly one of the best. Yeah, the Swiss could mobilize. Not only could they mobilize more than us in a week, in a month they would have almost 10 times as much as we do. So incredible how it works there. However, even though I do think the idea national service is a good idea, I want to provide a counter argument to this. Because if we are to have conscription as a policy, I believe, one, it should not be a reaction to what's happening currently in the world. And two, it should be a constant policy that is a mainstay in British society like it is in Switzerland. In Switzerland, it's an integral part of Swiss society. Key. And other places I know they do it in Greece as well. I think France have something similar. I don't know about all the countries in Europe. I know a lot more Eastern European countries do. And I think it should be the same in the United Kingdom. It should be a mainstay. It should be an integral part of being a British citizen. What I absolutely do not think is a good idea is having a policy of conscription or a citizens' army or national, whatever, in anticipation of going to war with another country. The message that sends to both our country and the people in this country, but also to the countries abroad, is that we're gearing up for a war that we do not even view as being unavoidable, hence why we're training our citizens to be able to fight. This is terrible. It's hostile and it's militaristic, and it could certainly inflame tensions, especially when we start calling out specific names. Like Russia, saying we're going to be with war with Russia in 20 years, so let's start training everyone to fight. In my opinion, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. And that is certainly one way of abusing the idea of national service. And as well, it just doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if you're responding to a military threat by introducing a citizens' army, when you're actually still ignoring whilst our own army is only getting an additional, I think I said £1.1 billion in funding adjusted to inflation. So we've got this threat here, and instead of focusing on our army, well, we'll give them 1.1 billion, but we're going to train everyone else. I really struggle to see the sense in that policy. We have a struggling, underfunded army that even America says they don't view as a top fighting force. Our own top general says war with Russia is possible fairly soon, and our response is to ignore the state of the army and have a citizens' army. That's ludicrous. Actually, it's worrying that is their solution. If that's the best, I mean, the solution is not even hard. It's not a difficult solution. It's very clear what the solution should be. And if that's the conclusion they've come to, as worrying, we've got some real fools in charge. So no, their approach to this is a bad idea. Strengthen our armed forces, significantly so, if we genuinely view that as a threat. The citizens' army shouldn't be how we solve the issue of a poor armed forces. You address the actual issue. I mean, take for example, you're building a house and you realise the house isn't actually, structurally sound. And the reason being is because you've built up this house or whatever, and you realise that, okay, I don't actually have as many bricks as I thought I did. This house is leaning to the left, or the wind's blowing at one side, or whatever, and you haven't really got many bricks left. What do? Well, I'll tell you what you're not going to do, is you're not going to take wood, cut it into the shape of a brick, combine the two, and plug the gap for the lack of bricks. No, you get more bricks. You improve the army. Start with what's actually the backbone of our defence, or in my analogy, the house. Get more bricks. Why are you trying to plug that gap with something that's going to be a lot less effective? We have the infrastructure there. We have some of the best, military minds in the world. We've got we have the best special forces in the world. Our military has a fantastic history. Just grow that institution so they are safe. get that engine running again. Don't plugging the gap with citizens who are going to half-ass it, and they're going to be somewhat trained, but they're not doing it every day because they're going to have to go back to their daily lives. That's a terrible idea. I mean, that is like a last resort. You've got your standing army, then you've got your reserves, and then you've got your then you'd maybe have a citizens army. That's like, right, if we need to, we're going to call on you. We're not going to use you as a stopgap to solve the problem. So I would recommend that they actually improve the conditions of our military first, and the things that I mentioned earlier on. That's first and foremost, because a strong military is the only way you're able to keep a country safe. And then you think about the national service and keep that as a mainstay policy, not just for anticipation for a war. Back to the message it sends. It's like, yeah, we're gonna send all these citizens off into the meat grinder. That's horrible. There's not even people that signed. You've got people who have signed up there, and many more people who want to sign up. Get them fighting ready. Well, they are fighting fit. Improve it, make it bigger, and then start looking at the rest of the nation if you need to. And the other thing as well, when I saw this, and I was very skeptical, and I'm very skeptical about the idea of conscription in this modern age because of a lot of the younger people. I'm not convinced that you would get enough of the right type of person in the army, or someone that you would consider to be reliable to join. I mean, when I look around, I'm walking around in public, or I look on social media, I think there are so many people that I look at and I genuinely think you are the last person I would want to have to rely on in battle. If you were in my foxhole, I'd rather actually just be alone, because it's just going to be an absolute liability for one reason or another. And there are so many people like that, and I'm just not convinced it would be a good idea. And as we've already said, there is a lot of people in this country who don't view this country as their own, but in fact they hate this country for whatever reason. And there's also a lot of unhealthy people, but there's also a lot of physically and mentally, not just unhealthy, but physically and mentally weak, who just couldn't be relied on. If you really needed to sort of get down and you were like, you're proper in the trenches, and you've got someone who's just like, I don't know, whinging, it's just not what you want. And which is why I would be so skeptical. I'd be very hesitant if I was in charge of policy to rely on this large population of people. And as well, so many young people, they're glued to their phones. They are glued to their phones and social media. And social media has had such an impact on their brains. It's like a rotten fruit, and people don't even realize it. That's the worst thing. I mean, for example, if you look at Israel and the Israeli army, and why, for example, am I seeing so many Instagrams or TikToks or social media posts about the army fighting? I mean, I've seen loads of these videos of like soldiers creating their own videos of like them in tanks and like posting it online. I mean, what the hell? If I'm going off to war and I'm marching alongside someone else and he's got the camera up in the air and he's filming me and him going, oh yeah, off to war. Oh my God, it would be the worst. I'd be like, I'm finished. I'm dead. If this is what we've got to rely on, I surrender already. And in fact, I think it would be, even though we're seeing a lot of these soldiers, these clips of Israeli soldiers making TikToks about fighting, I think it'd be worse in the UK. I think it would be a lot worse. And as well, people just don't have skill. People don't have a lot of skill for one reason or another. There's a lot of stupid people around. Probably, again, thanks to social media. But if you were depending on them to, I don't know, read a map or do something else that required a bit of common sense, you'd find that they're very unreliable. So I think relying on the citizens' army to plug the gap in our military is a terrible, terrible idea. But I'm saying to plug the gap. But if you, in anticipation of a war, if you were to have an increased size of the military, but you also had a legacy system of national service where you slowly started training people. So, these people that you think, I don't think you'd ever want to rely on them. Eventually they're all trained up, and you just raise the standards of people. After a while, I believe you'll see a lot of those people become a lot more productive and efficient, because relying on a citizens' army to plug that gap is based on the assumption that people are as capable as they were 30, 40 years ago. And the reality is they just aren't. So, we're seeing now countries in Europe, and it's mainly Europe, they're panicking. They are panicking because they've realised that, and because it's not just the UK that have gone through these military cuts. A lot of other countries have cut the size of their military, and you can see now that they realise that these silly policies for whatever reason they decided to cut the size of their military. They're now realising that this was a silly policy, because look what's happening. So in the UK, you've got generals saying we might need to have a citizens' army. Germany, for example, are saying that this year they're going to spend nearly 72 billion euros on their defence, because they realise that their armies are probably in a worse state than ours. So they're panicking, and this actually comes. Governments are now going to have to start really ramping up their defence spending, and this comes at a terrible time with inflation, the cost of living. So, as I said before, the UK were looking to increase it by 5 billion, but because of inflation, it's only 1 billion. So they're having to play catch up because they've had years of neglect. So if you had just maintained it over the years, it would have been okay. Maybe you step it up by 0.5%, but nope, you're going to have to do a massive catch-up, massive overhaul of everything just to ensure that you're at a safe enough level where you're not relying on America. And if you then want to go further beyond that, you're going to have to spend even more money. So again, consequences of poor leadership are coming around to finally haunt leaders in the West. And I want to conclude with a quote, a fantastic quote. A quote by Eric Hartman, and it follows: "War is a place where the young kill one another without knowing or hating each other, because of the decision of the old people who know and hate each other without killing one another."